Never judge a person's worth by the clothes they wear, because the greatest test of character often arrives disguised as someone you would never notice. Every Monday morning, thousands of employees streamed into the towering headquarters of Carter Global Holdings in downtown Chicago, each one carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and dreams of climbing the corporate ladder. Luxury sedans lined the curb, polished shoes clicked across the sidewalk, and conversations about promotions and bonuses echoed through the crisp morning air. Yet no one paid attention to the homeless man sitting quietly beside the stone planter near the main entrance. Wrapped in a faded brown coat with worn sneakers and a knit cap pulled low over his forehead, Ethan Carter looked exactly like another forgotten soul surviving another cold day in the city. A weathered backpack rested beside him, along with a small paper cup that remained nearly empty despite the steady flow of people. Some employees glanced at him with pity before looking away. Others acted as though he did not exist at all. A few whispered to one another, shaking their heads before disappearing through the revolving glass doors. Ethan never asked anyone for money. Instead, he simply watched. His calm brown eyes followed every employee who entered the building, quietly studying how they treated the people around them. Did they thank the security guards? Did they hold the door for strangers? Did they smile at the maintenance crew? Every gesture mattered. Every choice revealed something no resume ever could. Around 8 o'clock, a young accountant accidentally dropped a folder, scattering papers across the sidewalk. Several coworkers stepped around the mess without slowing down. Ethan immediately rose from the cold concrete, gathered every page with careful hands, and handed them back with a warm smile. The accountant accepted them without making eye contact or offering a thank you before rushing inside. Ethan simply nodded and returned to his seat. A few minutes later, a delivery driver struggled to unload heavy boxes from a truck parked along the curb. Once again, Ethan quietly walked over and helped carry several packages to the loading dock. The driver smiled gratefully, but 2 managers passing nearby frowned as though the homeless man had wandered somewhere he did not belong. One of them muttered that security should keep the entrance looking more professional. Ethan heard every word, but never reacted. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a small black notebook, and carefully wrote down 2 names before closing it again. Nobody noticed. Nobody wondered why a homeless beggar seemed more interested in people than in spare change. As the morning crowd continued pouring into Carter Global, one person finally slowed her pace. A young woman carrying a simple canvas lunch bag stopped a few feet away, looked directly into Ethan's eyes, and offered him the gentle smile that no one else had given him all morning. The young woman shifted her canvas lunch bag onto her shoulder before kneeling beside Ethan with a kindness that seemed almost forgotten in the rush of the city. She opened the bag and removed a neatly wrapped turkey sandwich, a fresh apple, and a bottle of water. "I packed a little extra this morning," she said with a gentle smile. "I was hoping someone might need it more than I do." Ethan looked at her quietly before accepting the meal with sincere gratitude. "Thank you," he replied softly. "Most people never stop long enough to see me." She shrugged with a warm laugh. "My grandmother always told me that the easiest way to recognize a good heart is by how it treats people who cannot offer anything in return." Ethan nodded slowly, letting her words settle in his mind. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Naomi answered. "She raised me to believe that everyone deserves dignity." Before she could say anything else, 2 employees walked by and exchanged amused glances. One whispered loudly enough for both of them to hear, "There goes Naomi again, making friends with another homeless guy." The other chuckled before disappearing inside the building. Naomi ignored the comment completely. "Do not let them bother you," she said. "People sometimes forget that hard times can happen to anyone." Ethan smiled faintly. "You believe that?" "Absolutely," she answered without hesitation. A person's circumstances can change overnight, but character stays with them. She checked her watch and sighed. I should get inside before I'm late. Ethan thanked her once again as she stood and walked toward the entrance with the same quiet confidence she had shown him. After she disappeared through the revolving doors, Ethan reached into his worn backpack and carefully opened the small black notebook again. Beside Naomi Brooks, he drew a single gold star instead of writing another ordinary note. Then he closed the notebook and resumed watching the endless stream of employees entering Carter Global. An hour later, a maintenance worker pushing a heavy cleaning cart accidentally dropped a bucket, sending supplies rolling across the marble walkway. Several executives frowned with irritation and stepped around the scattered items as though the worker had become invisible. Ethan quietly stood, collected the fallen supplies, and helped the embarrassed employee organize everything again. The grateful man thanked him with genuine appreciation before returning to work. Ethan noticed another pair of managers watching the scene with clear annoyance instead of compassion. Their names joined the growing list inside his notebook. By late morning, dark clouds drifted over downtown Chicago, and a cold breeze swept through the plaza. Employees hurried indoors without noticing the homeless man, calmly remaining on the bench, his eyes fixed on every smile, every insult, every ignored greeting, and every simple act of humanity. Across the street, a sleek black helicopter slowly appeared in the distance before circling above the city skyline. But instead of looking up like everyone else, Ethan quietly checked the time, closed his notebook, and whispered to himself, "Not yet." The helicopter disappeared behind the skyline as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the busy plaza to return to its ordinary rhythm. Ethan remained seated on the bench, patiently observing every detail around him. His experiment had never been about wealth. It had always been about truth. Expensive offices could hide many things, but everyday choices never lied. Shortly after noon, Ethan quietly left the front entrance and walked around the block toward the employee parking garage. Hundreds of vehicles filled the massive structure, and workers hurried in and out carrying laptops, lunch containers, and ringing cell phones. Ethan stood near a vending machine where several employees waited for the elevator. Some stepped away the moment they noticed his worn clothing. Others avoided looking at him entirely. A young intern accidentally dropped a stack of presentation folders while trying to answer a phone call. Ethan bent down immediately and helped gather every document before the wind carried them across the garage. The nervous intern accepted the folders with a quick thank you before rushing into the elevator without another word. Ethan smiled gently, expecting nothing in return. A few minutes later, he wandered toward the employee cafeteria entrance. Through the large windows, he could see workers laughing over lunch, while others sat alone scrolling through their phones. As he turned to leave, the cafeteria door opened, and Naomi stepped outside carrying another paper bag. She looked surprised to find him there. "I thought you might still be around," she said with a cheerful smile. "I bought an extra bowl of chicken soup because the weather is getting colder." Ethan accepted it gratefully. "You have already done more for me than anyone else today." Naomi sat on a nearby bench for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "How do you stay so calm when people treat you unfairly?" He looked toward the busy street before answering. "Because bitterness only steals more from the person who is already struggling. I would rather protect my peace than argue with someone who has already made up their mind about me." Naomi reflected on his words with quiet admiration. "I hope I never lose that kind of perspective." Before Ethan could respond, a black luxury sport utility vehicle rolled into the executive parking area. Victor Hayes stepped out wearing an expensive tailored suit, surrounded by two department managers discussing quarterly profits. As they approached the building, Victor noticed Naomi sitting beside Ethan. His expression hardened immediately. Even from a distance, Ethan could see irritation spread across the executive's face. Victor changed direction and walked straight toward them with confident strides, while several nearby employees slowed down to watch what would happen next. Ethan quietly lifted his eyes toward the approaching executive, remaining perfectly composed as Naomi slowly stood from the bench, unaware that the next few minutes would reveal far more about the company than any financial report ever could. Victor Hayes stopped a few feet from the bench and looked first at Naomi, then at Ethan, as though he had discovered something deeply unacceptable. Several employees entering the building slowed their pace, pretending to check their phones while quietly watching the scene unfold. Victor folded his arms and forced a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Naomi," he said, "I expected better judgment from someone representing this company." Naomi remained calm. "I'm on my lunch break, Mr. Hayes." "That is not the point," he replied. "Clients walk past this entrance every day. We work hard to maintain a professional image, and now one of our employees is sitting outside, having lunch with a homeless stranger." Ethan lowered his eyes and said nothing. Naomi answered respectfully, "He's a person, not a problem." Victor gave a short laugh. "Compassion is admirable, but there is a time and place for everything." Naomi refused to back away. Kindness does not need an appointment. A few nearby workers exchanged surprised looks. Victor's expression tightened. "Perhaps you should spend more time focusing on your career instead of rescuing people you do not even know." Naomi smiled politely. "Sometimes helping someone for 5 minutes says more about us than 8 hours behind a desk." The silence that followed became almost uncomfortable. Ethan quietly observed every word without interrupting. He noticed Brandon Lewis, the head of security, walking briskly toward them after receiving a message through his radio. Brandon stopped beside Victor and immediately looked at Ethan. "Sir, would you like me to remove him from company property?" Victor nodded without hesitation. "Please do. We cannot allow this kind of distraction outside the headquarters." Brandon approached Ethan with a firm but controlled voice. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to move across the street." Ethan slowly stood, picked up his worn backpack, and offered a calm smile. "Of course. I do not wish to cause trouble." Naomi looked disappointed. "He has not bothered anyone." Brandon sighed quietly. "I'm simply following instructions." Ethan placed a reassuring hand over his backpack strap and looked toward Naomi. "Thank you for treating me with respect today. Do not let anyone convince you that kindness is ever a mistake." Naomi nodded gently, feeling strangely encouraged by a man who appeared to own almost nothing. Ethan walked away without complaint, crossing the plaza as dozens of employees watched him leave. Victor adjusted his expensive jacket and turned toward Naomi. "Report to Human Resources after lunch. We need to discuss professional boundaries." Without waiting for a reply, he disappeared through the revolving doors with Brandon close behind. Naomi stood alone for a moment, wondering why doing something so simple suddenly felt so costly. Across the street, Ethan paused beside a newspaper stand, quietly opened his small black notebook once more, wrote 3 additional names beneath Victor Hayes, and then closed it with a thoughtful smile before glancing toward the top floor of the headquarters, where a meeting was already being prepared that would soon change every life inside the building. Naomi spent the rest of the afternoon trying to concentrate on her work, but Victor's warning echoed in her mind every time she opened another spreadsheet. She had never been written up, never missed a deadline, and never given anyone a reason to question her professionalism. Yet a simple act of kindness had suddenly placed her career in doubt. Across the city plaza, Ethan quietly watched the headquarters from a small public park where he could still observe employees leaving the building. As the afternoon sun began to sink behind the skyline, a sleek black sedan rolled silently to the curb beside him. The rear window lowered only a few inches. A well-dressed woman wearing a discreet earpiece looked toward Ethan with visible concern. "Everything is ready, sir," she said softly. "The board members have arrived, and tomorrow's executive session has been confirmed." Ethan gave a slight shake of his head. "Not yet, Claire. We still have one more day." She nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." Before anyone nearby could pay attention, the window closed, and the sedan merged back into traffic. Ethan remained on the park bench, as though nothing unusual had happened. Later that evening, inside the executive floor of Carter Global, Victor Hayes stood confidently before several department heads, reviewing the agenda for the following morning. "Tomorrow will be important," he announced. "The chairman has informed us that the owner may finally attend the leadership meeting in person. We must demonstrate absolute discipline throughout the company." Excited whispers spread around the conference room. Many employees had worked there for years without ever meeting the mysterious founder who rarely appeared in public. Victor smiled proudly, already imagining how impressed the owner would be with his leadership. Meanwhile, Brandon Lewis completed another security report before receiving a confidential message on his company tablet. The notice instructed all security personnel to prepare for an executive arrival, unlike any previous visit. Every entrance, hallway, elevator, and conference room would receive additional monitoring beginning at sunrise. Brandon assumed another influential investor was expected. He had no reason to think otherwise. Early the next morning, Ethan returned to the headquarters before dawn. The sidewalks were nearly empty, and the city had not yet reached its usual rush. He sat quietly on the same bench, wearing the same faded coat, while office lights slowly flickered on one floor after another. He watched janitors greeting one another warmly before beginning their shifts. He watched delivery drivers carrying supplies through the loading dock. He watched executives arrive without acknowledging the people holding doors open for them. Then he opened his small black notebook one more time. He slowly read every name he had written over the past several days before closing the cover with quiet certainty. Looking toward the towering glass building, Ethan smiled calmly as the first rays of sunlight reflected across its windows. "Today," he whispered to himself, "everyone will finally discover that character is the most valuable investment any company can ever make." By 8:30 that morning, the headquarters buzzed with nervous excitement, unlike anything Naomi had ever seen. Every conference room had been polished. Fresh flowers decorated the executive floor. Security officers stood at every major entrance, and employees whispered about the mysterious founder who was finally expected to appear after years of staying out of the public eye. Rumors spread from one department to another. Some believed the owner had been living overseas. Others insisted the billionaire preferred complete privacy and rarely trusted anyone inside the company. Victor Hayes welcomed every conversation with growing confidence. He walked through the executive offices shaking hands, reminding managers that professionalism would determine their future. "Today is an opportunity," he declared. "The owner expects excellence, and I intend to show exactly why this company has thrived under my leadership." Several department heads nodded in agreement, hoping to earn his favor. Downstairs, Brandon Lewis reviewed the final security checklist. Every visitor required identification. Every delivery truck received additional inspection. Nothing unusual would be allowed inside the building. Brandon felt satisfied that every possible risk had been eliminated. Outside the front entrance, however, Ethan quietly returned to the same familiar bench, carrying his worn backpack and small notebook. Employees noticed him immediately. Some rolled their eyes. Others whispered that security should have removed him permanently the day before. Ethan simply watched them pass, greeting anyone who happened to make eye contact with a warm smile. Almost no one returned it. Naomi arrived carrying her usual canvas bag and paused when she saw him. Relief crossed her face. "I'm glad you're all right," she said. "I was worried after yesterday." Ethan smiled. "Kindness always finds its way back. Thank you for asking." Naomi handed him a hot cup of coffee. "It is cold this morning." Ethan accepted it gratefully. Before they could continue talking, Brandon stepped outside with 2 additional security officers. He approached respectfully but firmly. "Sir, Today we are expecting important guests. I have to ask you to leave the front entrance." Ethan looked at him calmly. "Will I still be welcome later today?" Brandon hesitated, uncertain why such a simple question felt strangely important. "That decision is above my authority," he answered honestly. Ethan nodded with quiet understanding, picked up his backpack, and slowly walked toward the public plaza across the street. As he reached the corner, his phone vibrated inside the backpack. Shielded from view by a large stone fountain, he answered in a calm voice. Claire spoke immediately. "Sir, the board is assembled. The attorneys have arrived. Every director is waiting for your signal." Ethan glanced back at the towering headquarters, where hundreds of employees continued hurrying through the revolving doors without recognizing him. A peaceful smile appeared across his face. "Excellent," he replied. "Tell everyone the meeting will begin exactly on schedule, because in a few minutes, the company is finally going to meet the man they have been walking past all week." Inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. The largest conference table in the building had been prepared with polished leather folders, crystal water glasses, and nameplates for every board member. Directors from across the country had gathered in person, quietly discussing quarterly results, while waiting for the founder, whose face many of them had seen only in old photographs. Victor Hayes stood confidently near the front of the room, adjusting his expensive tie before rehearsing the welcome speech he had prepared for weeks. He believed this meeting would become the defining moment of his career. Brandon Lewis remained outside the conference room with additional security officers, making certain no unauthorized person entered the executive floor. Meanwhile, Naomi sat quietly at her desk downstairs, unable to focus on her computer screen. She wondered whether the homeless man had found somewhere warm to spend the morning. Somehow, despite knowing almost nothing about him, she felt that his calm words carried more wisdom than many executives she had met inside the company. At exactly 9 o'clock, every conversation inside the boardroom suddenly stopped. Claire entered first, dressed in an elegant navy business suit. Every director immediately stood to greet her, assuming she would introduce the owner. Instead, she smiled politely and stepped aside without saying a word. Seconds later, the conference room doors opened once again. Brandon glanced toward the hallway and immediately frowned. Walking calmly toward the entrance was the same homeless man he had asked to leave only minutes earlier. His faded coat remained buttoned. His worn backpack still rested over one shoulder. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Victor's face filled with disbelief. "How did he get up here?" he demanded loudly. Brandon stepped forward instinctively. "Sir, this floor is restricted. You cannot enter this meeting." Ethan stopped only a few feet from the doorway and looked at Brandon with the same peaceful expression he had worn all week. Before Brandon could speak again, Claire raised her hand. "Please step aside." Brandon looked confused. "Ma'am?" Her voice became firm. "Mr. Lewis, you will allow him to enter." Silence swept across the hallway. Ethan slowly walked through the conference room doors, while dozens of astonished eyes followed every step. Victor turned toward Claire in frustration. "What is the meaning of this? The owner could arrive at any moment." Claire smiled gently. "He already has." She turned toward Ethan with complete respect. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. The board is assembled and awaiting your direction." Every person in the room froze. Victor stared at the homeless man, then at Claire, unable to understand what he had just heard. Brandon's face lost all color. One board member immediately stood and greeted Ethan with a respectful handshake. Another addressed him as chairman. Without saying a single word, Ethan removed his worn coat, revealing an impeccably tailored suit beneath it that no one had noticed before. He placed his old backpack neatly beside the chairman's seat at the head of the table, looked around the silent room, and smiled calmly as the truth finally settled over everyone, like the weight of a storm they never saw coming. No one spoke for several long seconds. The silence inside the boardroom became heavier than any speech Victor Hayes had prepared. Ethan Carter calmly took his seat at the head of the table, while Claire placed a slim folder in front of him. Every board member remained standing until Ethan gave a small nod, inviting them to sit. Victor's hands trembled slightly as he lowered himself into his chair, replaying every encounter he had shared with the man he had dismissed as nothing more than a homeless stranger. Brandon remained near the doorway, unable to believe that the person he had repeatedly asked to leave the property was the founder of the company he had proudly protected for years. Ethan slowly opened the folder before looking around the room. For the past 7 days, he began in a calm and steady voice, I have walked through this company without a title, without expensive clothing, and without anyone recognizing my name. I wanted to discover whether our culture reflected the values upon which this organization was built. Claire pressed a button on the conference room remote, and the large presentation screen came to life. Security footage from the previous week appeared before everyone. The first video showed Ethan helping the young accountant collect scattered papers, while dozens of employees walked past without offering assistance. The second showed him carrying boxes for a delivery driver, while several managers complained about his presence instead of thanking him. Another recording revealed maintenance workers being ignored by executives rushing toward meetings. Then the footage changed once again. Naomi appeared on the screen, offering Ethan a sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water, with a warm smile. The room remained completely silent, as another recording showed her bringing him hot coffee the following morning. Ethan paused the presentation and looked toward the board. Only one employee consistently demonstrated compassion without expecting recognition or reward. Victor lowered his eyes, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. Claire advanced to the next recording. This time, everyone watched Victor publicly criticize Naomi for showing kindness, followed by Brandon respectfully asking Ethan to leave the entrance after receiving instructions. Ethan did not speak while the videos continued. Every uncomfortable moment unfolded exactly as it had happened. No opinions were necessary, because the truth spoke for itself. When the final recording ended, Ethan quietly closed the presentation. Financial success can be measured on spreadsheets, he said. Character cannot. A company becomes great because of the way its people treat those who can offer them nothing. The directors slowly nodded in agreement. Several looked visibly disappointed by what they had witnessed. Victor finally stood and took a deep breath. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, I owe you a sincere apology. I judged you entirely by your appearance, and I failed to uphold the values this company represents. Brandon also stepped forward respectfully. So do I, sir. I believed I was protecting the building, but I never stopped to consider the person standing in front of me. Ethan listened without anger or satisfaction. His expression remained calm as he looked around the room once more before saying, Today is not about humiliation. It is about accountability, and accountability is where real leadership begins. The board meeting concluded with decisions that reached far beyond financial reports. Ethan Carter slowly stood and looked around the room one final time before speaking. Every organization eventually becomes a reflection of what it rewards, he said. From this day forward, Carter Global will reward integrity as highly as performance. He turned toward Victor Hayes. Your experience and intelligence helped this company grow. But leadership requires more than results. It requires respect for every person who walks through our doors. Victor lowered his head with sincere regret. Ethan accepted his apology but explained that accountability required real consequences. Victor would no longer serve as Chief Operations Officer and would instead transition out of the executive team under the supervision of the board. Ethan then faced Brandon Lewis. You treated me respectfully even while enforcing instructions, But true leadership sometimes requires the courage to question actions that conflict with human dignity. Brandon accepted the lesson with gratitude and promised never to overlook compassion again. Ethan nodded before asking Claire to invite one more person into the boardroom. A few moments later, Naomi entered cautiously, believing she had been called to discuss the warning she received the previous day. Instead, every board member stood as she walked into the room. Confused, she looked from one face to another before recognizing Ethan sitting at the head of the table. Her eyes widened with astonishment, but Ethan greeted her with the same warm smile she had first offered him outside the building. "Please have a seat, Naomi," he said kindly. She slowly sat down, still trying to understand everything she had just witnessed. Ethan opened the small black notebook that had traveled with him throughout the entire experiment. "During the past week," he explained, "I wrote down hundreds of observations. Most names appeared because of missed opportunities to show kindness. Only one name received a gold star." He turned the notebook so everyone could see her name written neatly across the page. "You never asked who I was. You never wondered whether helping me would benefit your career. You simply chose compassion because that is who you are." Naomi smiled humbly. "I only treated you the way I hoped someone would treat my family." Ethan nodded. "That answer is exactly why you belong in this room." Marte, he announced that Naomi would become the director of the company's newly established Community Outreach and Employee Culture Foundation, reporting directly to his office. The promotion came with a leadership salary, educational opportunities, and the responsibility of helping build a workplace where every employee felt respected, regardless of title or position. Tears of gratitude filled Naomi's eyes, but she quietly replied, "Thank you for believing in me. I will do everything I can to honor that trust." As the meeting ended, Ethan and Naomi walked together through the main lobby. Employees stopped what they were doing as they watched the founder shake hands with the woman who had once shared her lunch with a stranger. Ethan paused at the front entrance, where he had spent so many quiet mornings, and looked back at the people gathered inside. "Never assume that greatness always arrives wearing an expensive suit," he said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes it arrives looking like the person everyone else chooses to ignore."